3 seconds. That's all it took for a brand new luxury SUV to turn a months-long neighborhood power game into a very expensive lesson. 1 second it was rolling forward like it on the road. The next there was a sound so solid, so final, that everybody on the street knew something had gone terribly wrong. The crazy part, I wasn't even outside when it happened. I was standing in my kitchen holding a coffee mug, watching the whole thing unfold on a security camera. And if you're thinking this story is about a car accident, it isn't. It's about what happens when somebody spends months testing your boundaries and mistakes your patience for weakness. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 46 years old, retired military, and these days I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Oklahoma. Nothing about my life is particularly exciting, and honestly, that's exactly how I like it. After years of deployments, noise, chaos, and constantly looking over my shoulder, I learned to appreciate boring. Boring is underrated. Boring means sleeping through the night. Boring means drinking coffee on your back porch while the sun comes up and knowing exactly how your day is going to go. For almost 6 years, that's exactly what my life was. Then the Hendersons moved in next door. Now, before anybody gets the wrong idea, I don't dislike people because they have money. Some of the hardest working people I've ever met became successful. Good for them. But there are certain people who don't just enjoy success, they weaponize it. They walk into a room believing everybody else should automatically move out of their way. That was Clea Henderson. Her husband, Trevor, was some kind of corporate litigation attorney. Nice suits, expensive watches, the kind of guy who somehow managed to smile without looking friendly. Clea was different. She didn't hide her attitude behind politeness. She wore it like jewelry. Within weeks of moving in, they tore down the old house and built what looked more like a country club than a home. Massive white exterior, oversized columns, security cameras everywhere, 4-car garage, perfect landscaping. Every contractor truck in town seemed to spend 6 months parked outside their property. At first, I stayed out of it. Then little things started happening. Their landscaping crew would blow grass clippings directly into my yard. Their delivery drivers would leave packages on my porch because they didn't want to walk the extra distance. Their guests would park partially in front of my property. None of it was worth a confrontation, at least not individually. But over time, those little things start stacking up, like pebbles in your shoe. One pebble doesn't matter. 50 of them absolutely do. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I remember the time because I looked at my watch. 8:14 a.m. I had a doctor's appointment across town. Nothing serious, just routine. I grabbed my keys, stepped outside, and immediately stopped. A black luxury SUV was parked directly across the bottom of my driveway, not near it, not partially blocking it, directly across it. I stood there for a second trying to figure out if maybe somebody was dropping something off. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. 10 minutes. Still nothing. Finally, I walked next door and rang the bell. Clea answered. I pointed toward the driveway. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but somebody's blocking my driveway." She glanced past me and immediately said, "Oh, that's mine." No apology, no embarrassment, nothing. I waited a second. "Okay, would you mind moving it?" She sighed, actually sighed, like I had interrupted something important. "I'm waiting for a furniture delivery." I blinked. "Right, but I need to leave." "It'll only be a few minutes." That was the entire conversation. No sorry, no my mistake, just "it'll only be a few minutes." 25 minutes later she finally moved it. I was late, but I let it go. Everybody deserves one mistake. The problem was the next morning it happened again. Same SUV, same location, same time. And when I walked over, Clea didn't even pretend to be surprised. That's when the little voice in the back of my head started paying attention. Because accidents don't happen on a schedule. Patterns do. Over the next few weeks, it became routine. Every morning around 8:15, her vehicle somehow ended up blocking my driveway, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes 30. One morning, it was almost an hour. Every conversation felt exactly the same. "Can you move your vehicle? It'll only be a minute. You're blocking my driveway. It's not a big deal. You've done this 3 days in a row. You're overreacting." At first, I tried being reasonable. Then I tried being direct. Nothing changed. One morning I caught her outside checking her mail. I figured maybe face-to-face would work better. "Clea, we need to figure something out." She didn't even look up from her phone. "About what?" "The driveway." That got her attention, unfortunately not in a good way. She slowly lowered the phone and smiled, not a friendly smile, the kind that says somebody's already decided they're right. "What about it?" "You keep blocking it." "It's a public street." "No, you're blocking access to private property," she shrugged. "So leave earlier." I honestly laughed, not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. "Leave earlier, sure. So I need to adjust my schedule because you keep parking in front of my driveway." She smiled again, that same smile. "Sounds easier than having this conversation every week." And there it was. The moment everything changed, because suddenly it wasn't about parking anymore. Parking was just the excuse. This was about control. She wanted me to adapt. She wanted me inconvenienced. She wanted to prove she could do it. I wish I could tell you I confronted her right then. I didn't. Years ago maybe, but not anymore. Age teaches you things. One of them is that anger feels productive right up until it creates a bigger problem. So I walked away, and that confused her. I could tell. People like Clea expect resistance. They expect arguments. What they don't know how to handle is patience. Over the next month, I stopped debating, stopped arguing, stopped explaining. Instead, I started paying attention. Dates, times, photos, camera footage, patterns. Because if military service taught me anything, it's that emotions make terrible evidence. Facts don't. Then, just when I thought Clea couldn't get more arrogant, something arrived in my mailbox that completely changed the game. An official legal envelope from Trevor Henderson's law firm. I stood in my kitchen reading it once, then twice. By the second read-through, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. According to the letter, my requests for access to my own driveway constituted harassment, intimidation, and ongoing interference with their peaceful enjoyment of their property. I remember setting the paper down on the counter and staring at it for a long moment. That was when something became crystal clear. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't a neighbor dispute, this was strategy. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I stopped thinking about how to solve the problem and started thinking about how to end it permanently. After that letter showed up, I didn't call Trevor. I didn't argue with Clea. I didn't write some angry response filled with legal threats and neighborhood drama. Honestly, I think that's exactly what they were expecting. People like that usually win because they know how to create emotional reactions. Once you're emotional, you make mistakes. Once you make mistakes, they control the narrative, so I gave them nothing. For the next few weeks, I acted like the letter had worked. Whenever Clea blocked my driveway, I didn't knock on her door. I didn't complain. I didn't even look annoyed. I simply parked farther down the street and went about my day. And because people tend to see what they want to see, they interpreted my silence as surrender. The problem was, while they thought the fight was over, I had quietly started doing homework. Every evening after dinner, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a laptop, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee, digging through county records, property maps, zoning regulations, and municipal codes. It wasn't exciting work. Most of it was painfully boring. Legal language has a special talent for making simple ideas sound complicated, but eventually patents started emerging. One city office referred me to another. That office referred me somewhere else. Every answer seemed frustratingly incomplete. It depends on the property line. It depends on the survey. It depends on the easement. Everything depended on documents I didn't have, which meant there was only one thing left to do: get a survey. A couple weeks later, a surveyor named Carl showed up just after sunrise. Carl looked exactly like every surveyor you've ever imagined. Weathered face, sun-faded cap, pickup truck that had probably seen 300,000 miles. The kind of guy who didn't waste words because he'd spent most of his life working alone. He walked the property with me, reviewed old county records, hammered temporary markers into the ground, and spent most of the morning taking measurements. I mostly stayed out of his way. Every now and then he'd scribble something on a clipboard, stare at a map, then move 50 feet and do it again. Around lunchtime he walked back over. "You got a neighbor issue," I smiled. "That obvious," he laughed. "Nobody spends this much money on a survey unless somebody's causing trouble." Fair point. 3 days later, the results arrived. I unfolded the paperwork across my kitchen table, and that's when everything changed. At first, I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at. Lines, measurements, boundary markings. Then one detail caught my attention. I checked it again. Then a third time because I genuinely thought I was reading it wrong. The apron section of my driveway, the portion where it met the street, extended farther than I'd assumed. Not by much, roughly 18 inches, maybe a little more in one section. Not enough for most people to notice. But legally it mattered a lot. Because Clea wasn't technically parking across public roadway access. Part of the area she repeatedly blocked affected protected access rights connected directly to my surveyed property. For nearly 2 months she'd been confidently arguing about rules she didn't actually understand. I leaned back in my chair and just sat there. No excitement, no celebration, just clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when confusion finally disappears. For the first time since this started, I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where she didn't. The next step took patience. A lot of patience. Because discovering information and using information are two very different things. The temptation to walk next door was strong. Trust me. Part of me wanted to knock on her door, drop the survey on her welcome mat, and enjoy watching the expression on her face. But that wouldn't solve anything. It would just create another argument. And arguments were her specialty. So instead, I started making calls. Permits, contractors, city approvals, engineering requirements, every box got checked. Every signature got collected. Every document got filed. If I was going to do something, I wanted it done so correctly that nobody, not Trevor, not a judge, not a city inspector, could find a single flaw. About 3 weeks into the process, I met with a contractor named Rick. Rick was one of those guys who understood situations before you finished explaining them. I showed him the survey, showed him the property line, explained the access issue. He studied everything quietly, then looked at me. "You want decorative?" I shook my head. "No," he smiled slightly. "You want permanent?" "Exactly." He nodded. "I know what you're looking for." A week later, he brought diagrams, heavy-duty steel bollards, industrial grade, powder-coated yellow, 4-inch diameter steel. Concrete foundations. The kind of thing designed to stop vehicles, not discourage them, stop them. When Rick showed me the drawings, he tapped the paper. "Once these are installed, they're not moving." I looked at the diagram. "That's kind of the point," he laughed. "Thought so." Installation was scheduled for a Friday morning, very early, partly because the crew preferred cooler temperatures, partly because I wanted the work finished before the neighborhood woke up. Not because I was hiding anything. Everything was fully permitted. I simply wasn't interested in creating a spectacle. The night before installation, I slept surprisingly well, not because I expected revenge. Honestly, revenge wasn't what I felt. Relief was closer. For months I'd been reacting. Now I finally had a solution. Friday morning arrived. 5:10 a.m. The crew rolled in with 2 trucks and a trailer. The neighborhood was still dark. Porch lights glowed softly up and down the street. Most people were asleep. Rick met me at the driveway. We reviewed measurements one final time. He compared the survey stakes against the installation plan. Everything matched. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's do it." The work moved quickly. Post-hole equipment chewed into the ground. Concrete got mixed. Steel cylinders were lowered into place, one by one, methodically, precisely. Watching them install those bollards felt strangely satisfying, not because they were obstacles, because they represented certainty. For months, everything had existed in gray areas, opinions, arguments, interpretations. Now there was something physical, something measurable, something undeniable. By 7:40 a.m., the installation was complete. 6 bright yellow steel bollards stood in a perfectly straight line along the access boundary. Simple, clean, impossible to miss. Rick walked over, wiped dust from his gloves, and looked at the finished work. "Those'll be here longer than both of us." I smiled. "That's the plan." The crew packed up and left. Soon afterward, the street became quiet again. Birds chirping, sprinklers running, the distant hum of morning traffic, an ordinary suburban morning. I went inside, made fresh coffee, sat down at the kitchen counter, and opened my security camera feed, not because I expected trouble, at least that's what I told myself. The camera angle showed the driveway perfectly. The street, the mailbox, the front of Clea's property. And now 6 bright yellow bollards standing exactly where they were supposed to stand. 8:00 a.m. Nothing. 8:10, still nothing. 8:15, no SUV. I took a sip of coffee. Maybe that was it. Maybe seeing the installation was enough. Maybe common sense had finally won. By 8:25, I was actually starting to believe it. The fight might truly be over. No confrontation, no drama, no grand finale, just a quiet resolution. Honestly, that outcome sounded pretty good. Then at 8:41, movement appeared on the camera. A familiar black luxury SUV backed out of the Henderson driveway. I immediately recognized it. Clea. The vehicle paused briefly, then turned toward the street, toward my driveway, toward the 6 steel bollards. And as I watched the screen, something in my stomach tightened. Not because I expected what was about to happen, because I suddenly realized she wasn't looking where she was going. One hand was on the wheel. The other appeared to be holding her phone. The SUV continued rolling forward. Slowly, confidently, like it had traveled this exact path 100 times before, because it had. The only difference was that today the path had changed, and Clea didn't know it yet. I remember setting my coffee mug down without even thinking about it. On the screen, Clea was still looking downward for brief moments, glancing between the road and whatever was on her phone. Not fully distracted, but distracted enough. And then it happened. The front bumper met solid steel. The sound exploded through the quiet morning. Not a movie-style crash, not screeching tires, not shattered glass flying everywhere. It was something heavier than that. A deep metallic impact. The sound of an object designed to move colliding with something designed specifically not to. The SUV's front end dipped hard. The hood jolted upward. Plastic shattered. A cloud of steam began rising almost immediately. For a moment, everything became still. Then Clea's driver's side door flew open. Even through the camera, I could see the confusion on her face. She stepped out fast, looking first at the front of the SUV, then at the yellow bollards, then back at the SUV again, as if one of those things had to be wrong. I stood there for another few seconds. Then I walked outside. By the time I reached the driveway, she was already yelling. "What is this?" I looked at the bollards. "The bollards. Don't play games with me." She pointed at the damage. "You can't just put these here." I remember being surprisingly calm. Months earlier, I probably would have been angry, but anger had long since burned itself out. All that remained was certainty. "Actually," I said, "I can." Her eyes widened, not because of what I said, because of how casually I said it. People expect conflict. They know how to fight conflict. Confidence without emotion is much harder to deal with. This is public property. No, it absolutely is. No, Clea. I pointed toward the survey markers that were still partially visible. That's been professionally surveyed. For the first time all morning, she looked uncertain, just for a second. Then the front door of her house opened. Trevor appeared. Even from 50 feet away, he looked irritated, still adjusting his suit jacket, still carrying his phone. "What happened?" Clea immediately pointed at me. "He put these things in the road." Trevor walked over quickly. Then he saw the SUV, the damaged bumper, the coolant leaking onto the pavement, the yellow bollards, and I watched his expression change. Because unlike Clea, Trevor was smart enough to realize there might be information he didn't have. He looked at me. "What exactly is going on?" Without saying a word, I turned around, walked inside, and grabbed the folder I'd prepared days earlier. Then I handed it to him. Survey, permits, city approvals, installation documents, contractor certifications, everything. At first he kept talking while flipping through the pages. "You can't obstruct," then he stopped. The sentence simply died. He kept reading, page after page, slower each time, more carefully. The confidence disappeared first, then the irritation, then the legal posturing. Finally, there was only silence. Clea looked between us. "What?" Trevor didn't answer. "What does it say?" Still nothing. A few more seconds passed. Then he closed the folder, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone accepting a fact they don't enjoy. Finally, he looked at her. Call a tow truck. That was it. No threats, no arguments, no legal lecture, just call a tow truck. And somehow that sentence carried more weight than anything he'd said before, because it told me exactly what he had found in those documents. Nothing. No loophole, no mistake, no angle, no argument. The next 48 hours were predictably messy. Insurance adjusters called, photos were requested, statements were taken, questions were asked. Everyone seemed to be searching for someone else to blame. The problem was that facts have a way of simplifying complicated situations. The camera footage showed the entire incident. The permits were valid. The survey was valid. The installation was legal. The bollards were visible. The weather was clear. The driver hit a stationary object. There simply wasn't much room for interpretation. A few days later, I learned her insurance claim had been denied. Apparently, striking a clearly visible fixed object doesn't generate much sympathy from adjusters. Who knew? I wish I could tell you that was the end. It wasn't, because then we arrived at the part nobody had anticipated: the damages. When a vehicle hits industrial steel bollards embedded in concrete, the bollards usually win, but they don't always walk away completely untouched. One of the foundations required repair. The concrete needed replacement. There were inspection costs, engineering reviews, additional contractor labor. Then there were the survey expenses, permit fees, consultation fees, everything connected to the situation. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I documented everything, every invoice, every receipt, every estimate, every dollar. The total came out just under $30,000. Even looking at the number made me pause. It wasn't a small amount. Then again, neither was the amount of effort required to reach that point. I sent the documentation through proper channels. A week later, I heard from a different attorney. Not Trevor, someone else, probably for obvious reasons. The new attorney was polite, professional, reasonable, which immediately made him easier to deal with. He talked about compromise, shared responsibility, finding common ground, avoiding unnecessary escalation. I listened respectfully. Then I gave him the same answer every time. No, not because I was being stubborn. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It had become a consequence, and consequences only work when they actually exist. Several more conversations followed. Several more offers arrived, each one slightly higher than the last. Eventually, reality caught up with everyone involved. About a month later, a settlement agreement was finalized. Full reimbursement, structured payments, formal county documentation clarifying access rights, and perhaps most importantly, severe penalties for future violations. The paperwork was boring, the outcome wasn't. After everything was signed, something unexpected happened. Peace returned, not friendship, definitely not friendship, but peace. The daily driveway issue vanished overnight, the arguments disappeared, the tension faded. Life became boring again. Wonderful, beautiful, boring. These days I still drink coffee on my back porch every morning. I still wake up around the same time. I still enjoy the quiet. Sometimes around 8:15 I'll glance toward the front window. Old habits die hard. And every now and then I'll see Clea walking to her mailbox. The SUV sits safely inside one of the 4 garage spaces she always had available. Funny how that works. The 6 yellow bollards are still there too. People occasionally ask why I never removed them. The answer is simple. They aren't there as a threat. They aren't there as revenge. They aren't there as a trophy. They're there because boundaries only matter when they're visible. Looking back, I genuinely don't think this was ever about parking. Parking was just the symptom. The real issue was entitlement. The belief that inconvenience only counts when it happens to you. The belief that being louder somehow makes you right. The belief that patience equals weakness. And maybe that's the lesson I took away from all of it. Not every battle needs aggression. Not every victory requires confrontation. Sometimes the strongest move you can make is refusing to play the game someone else designed for you. You stay calm. You learn the rules. You do the work. And eventually reality handles the rest. Now here's where I'd love to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Did I simply protect my property rights after months of being pushed around? Or did I go too far by installing something I knew would eventually force the issue? Where do you think the line exists between standing your ground and setting a trap? Because depending on who you ask, I'm either the reasonable neighbor who finally defended himself, or the stubborn guy who waited for karma to do the heavy lifting. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an entitled neighbor, a property dispute, or someone who confused kindness for weakness, share your story too. I'd love to read it. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for the next story. Trust me, some of them get even crazier than this.